Hey guys, this is a quick U.S. history update for a few of you that are gone. I've got more than one of you gone, so I just thought I'd go ahead and do a quick little video update and upload it to Google Classroom so you can kind of figure out what we're doing and where we're going and all of that jazz. So hopefully you've been following along in RenWeb. We're still talking about the Civil War. Some of you have been gone longer than others, so some of this may be a review for those of you that were here on Wednesday of last week or even Monday. I'm just going to kind of walk through a PowerPoint that I'm going to upload for you. We spent most of Friday talking about the death of Stonewall Jackson and the kind of the turning point of the war. And we watched a big chunk of the movie Gods and Generals, actually about 40 minutes of it, that shows or depicts or portrays the death of Stonewall Jackson. So I'm going to kind of zip through this PowerPoint, so follow along with me. Open up that PowerPoint that I sent you. And so on Wednesday, we talked about the fact that after the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Antietam was fought in Maryland, and Maryland is Union territory. And Robert E. Lee's army decided to take it to the north and invaded them in order to try to instill a little fear in them. Fighting a war in somebody else's theater is a little bit different than when you're fighting it in your own backyard. And so Robert E. Lee, after McClellan was unsuccessful in capturing Richmond, heads up towards the Washington, D.C. and diverts into Maryland, where the Battle of Antietam takes place. Now, if you recall, George McClellan, General McClellan of the Army of the Potomac, or the Union Army, had stumbled upon the battle plans or intentions for Robert E. Lee in Maryland, and so he kind of knew what he was doing. And McClellan, unlike him, actually acted fairly quickly. Once he determined it wasn't just like some sort of trap, that they were actually the battle plans, he pursued Robert E. Lee, and they met at a place called Antietam, Maryland. Also, I want to mention that my phone is having some microphone problems, and so I probably sound like I'm in a tin can. I'm going to resolve that by biting the bullet and buying a new phone. I am long due for a new phone, so I apologize for the way that this sounds. Hopefully, if you have to listen to me again, that will be resolved. But for today, it is what it is. So anyway, so at the Battle of Antietam, Maryland, which was fought in the Union, it was Robert E. Lee versus George McClellan. It was I will say, indecisive victory for the Union. They managed to chase Robert E. Lee back, or at least Robert E. Lee turned and headed back towards familiar territory in the Confederacy in the state of Virginia. George McClellan chose not to follow him, which cost him his job. Abraham Lincoln ended up firing him as a result of that. It could have been a much more decisive victory, but it was still considered a Union victory nonetheless. And so Abraham Lincoln decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. The Battle of Antietam was fought in September of 1862, and the Emancipation Proclamation was released in January of 1863. My dog needs to get in. Hold on. Okay, sorry. So, anyhow, that's what we talked about largely on, I think it was in class on Wednesday. And so, if you were to ask a historian or a war expert in December of 1862 which way this war was going to go, they probably would have told you they don't know. There were pros and cons. Both sides had made some gains. Both sides had lost some significant battles. And so it was up in the air. The Confederacy was willing to fight on. I would say that the states in the Union under Abraham Lincoln were getting weary. They had anticipated this would be a short-lived rebellion and everything would be okay in a matter of months, and that was not the case. Abraham Lincoln is going to be facing re-election problems because of the length of the war, and so nobody knew for sure in the Christmas of 1862 what was going to happen. In class on Wednesday, we watched a couple of clips from Gods and Generals that depicted Confederate Army at Christmas time in 1862. Their spirits were still high in spite of the loss at Antietam. So I'm just going to zip through really quick where we are, how we got there, okay? So you'll have this PowerPoint You'll have the slide in your PowerPoint. So Lincoln is elected in November of 1860. Before he even became president, in March of 1861, 7 southern states had seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. They had elected Jefferson Davis as the president of that new Confederate government. Abraham Lincoln is sworn in office in 1861. In April of 1861, a month later, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, decided to fire upon a federal fort called Fort Sumter, firing the first shots of the war, and so the war is on. In response to this, Abraham Lincoln calls up 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months, thinking it would be a quick fight, and he would squash the rebellion. However, several of the border states are not happy about this because Abraham Lincoln is going to have to march that army through their states in order to squash that rebellion, and so 4 more states joined the Confederacy, Virginia and Arkansas being 2 of those. Virginia, probably the most significant loss of all 11 states that eventually joined the Confederate Army, or Confederate states. In July of 1861, the first real battle takes place at Manassas Junction, also called the Battle of Bull Run, which was the creek that ran through there. It was a 2-day battle. The first day the Confederates lost a significant area, but then Stonewall Jackson and I think Robert E. Lee's armies came in behind and reinforced the Confederate Army, and they prevailed, and they chased the Union Army back towards Washington, D.C. This is the battle. It was 30 miles south or so of Washington, D.C., where people came to watch the battle. So in response to this defeat, Abraham Lincoln thinks, okay, this is going to be longer than I thought, and he calls up 1 million soldiers to serve for 3 years. And they concoct what's known as the Anaconda Plan to defeat the Confederacy. The Anaconda Plan included blockading southern ports, capturing the Mississippi River, cutting the Confederacy in 2, and then capturing the capital of Richmond, Virginia. Let's see here. In February of 1862, hold on, somebody's texting me. In February of 1862, Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary, suffer a personal tragedy when one of their 2 young sons, Willie, dies from typhoid, I think. Great personal tragedy to the Lincolns helps Abraham Lincoln understand or appreciate a little bit more the suffering of those families that were losing soldiers in the fight. April of 1862, Ulysses S. Grant, who's kind of an unknown at this point, is fighting armies in what would be considered the West because it wasn't over there by Virginia. The Battle of Shiloh, Tennessee is a surprise attack on the Union Army under Ulysses S. Grant. The Confederate Army comes into their camp, completely catches them off guard, but Grant regroups the next day or so, and he counterattacks and chases the Confederates out of there. But it taught a very valuable lesson that if the Union Army was going to spend most of its time in the South, they needed to have scouts that knew the area, were on the watch for Confederate scouts and Confederate Army, and then the camps needed to be what's the word that I was using? Fortified. They needed to have cannons and arms in the exterior perimeter of the camp in order to give warning if an army does sneak by, and also to defend themselves. And then April through June of 1862, the Union Army attempts to capture the Mississippi River, that part of the Anaconda Plan, and they capture New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Natchez, Louisiana, I believe that is, pretty quickly. And there's a few other cities along the way. David Farragut is the Commodore or the Admiral that's in charge of this fleet, and is successful in capturing some of these major cities. The capture of New Orleans was a huge defeat for the Confederates because it was such a huge, massive port city for products and troop movement and all of that stuff. So things are tending towards the Union. And then General McClellan finally gets kicked back out of D.C. again, and a year later, and Abraham Lincoln's like, dude, you've got to go after Richmond, you've got to capture that capital city, you've got to get rid of Robert E. Lee, we need you to do this now. Finally, McClellan felt like he had enough men and enough preparation. He heads down the peninsula, down to the Chesapeake rather than straight over to Richmond, winds his way around, probably to his demise. He only gets about 6 miles. Well, he gets about 6 miles from Richmond, and Robert E. Lee is using all kinds of unusual military tactics. McClellan is totally confused, thinks he may even be surrounded, and so he gives up and he heads back towards D.C. because he's heard, or there's a suspicion, that Robert E. Lee's men have broken off and are headed towards the Capitol, which is undefended basically at this point. And so McClellan hightails it for Washington, D.C., and that is when the Battle of Antietam takes place. As McClellan is heading back to D.C., the Second Battle of Bull Run happens between the two armies. They proceed further north and discover Robert E. Lee's battle plans, meet him at Antietam, Maryland, and have a indecisive victory there. McClellan is fired. He is replaced by General Hooker. That's right. Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation is announced in January 1st of 1863. Abraham Lincoln says, "This is contraband. I'm going to use my war powers, and I'm going to confiscate slaves, give them their freedom." Confiscate meaning allow them to come across the lines to freedom, or announce to those areas where the rebellion is happening that those slaves are free. They are no longer allowed to be enslaved because of their ability to help the war effort. So Abraham Lincoln used all kinds of legalese to issue this Emancipation Proclamation. He knew it wouldn't stand the test of time, and that there would have to be a 13th Amendment to the Constitution to ultimately outlaw slavery, but it was an excellent step in the right direction. All right, so that brought us to the end of the first page of timeline that I gave you. There's a copy of it in the PowerPoint. That represents the first half of the war, so from the election of Abraham Lincoln to the Emancipation Proclamation. Enter the picture, the next slide that you see, George McClellan is fired, and Union General Joseph Hooker replaces McClellan. And Hooker was probably a good soldier, but not a very good man. And he hailed from Massachusetts. He was kind of a hero up there, and he had a terrible reputation of heavy drinking and bringing in prostitutes into the officers' camps to entertain the officers during the down season. And so I suppose you could say he was, I don't want to say liked, but appreciated in a different way than George McClellan was. He's just kind of a wild guy. And so I told the other classes, the classes when you weren't there, so I'll go ahead and throw this out there. And I think I've mentioned this before, but historically, prostitution, the word prostitution is what we call women who make money doing that particular occupation. And during the war, because General Hooker would hire or invite prostitutes to the camp, they became known as Hooker's ladies or Hooker's women, the Hooker Brigade sometimes, in some cases. And so that is where the slang word for prostitute, hooker, comes into play. It's actually named after this guy, which is super embarrassing for him. Anyhow, I wanted to share that with you because I had shared that with the class and I didn't want you to get thrown off there. I didn't know that. Nobody ever told me that when I was growing up and taking history classes, but one of my coworkers who taught AP for many years, before y'all were, probably when you guys were in grade school, shared that with me, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's really embarrassing. And there's a statue of General Hooker in front of the Capitol building in Boston, which I have always found very distasteful. Don't get it. But anyway, all right, so after Antietam and then the Emancipation Proclamation, the soldiers didn't tend to fight during the wintertime, and so springtime comes and you have several big campaigns, and so Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson's men are going to try to rout the Union Army out of Virginia again, and they're going to meet them in Chancellorsville. Robert E. Lee puts Stonewall Jackson in charge of this attack. This was I told the kids, I wish you guys could have seen this scene. I'm going to see if I can find it on YouTube, but the Battle of Chancellorsville in the movie Gods and Generals is probably one of the most beautifully cinematic work of the Civil War that I've ever seen. It's just beautiful. the way that they come in and the formations that the officers make. That would be my doggy again. Anyway, I think I'm going to have to let him out. Hold on a second. Come here. Come on. Come on. Come on. You are trouble. Both of you get out of here. Come on. All right. And anyway, all right, so the General Joseph Hooker of the Union armies, his army is caught off guard. Stonewall Jackson discovers a road towards the camp that nobody knows about, the Union Army doesn't know about. And so he manages to sneak in several thousand troops behind the encampment and comes upon the camp, sort of like what happened at Shiloh. The Union Army is on the run. They are fleeing towards Union territory as fast as they can. It was a huge victory for the Confederate Army. It was a huge embarrassment to Abraham Lincoln. He didn't even know how he was going to tell people what had happened. When Joseph Hooker wired him and told him what had happened, Abraham Lincoln was just despondent. He could not believe that this could happen, that his new general could allow this to happen. And so the sad part of the story, however, is that Stonewall Jackson, who was intent on pushing the Union Army completely into Union territory, found himself too deep into enemy territory, and the sun sets, and he and his entourage are entwined or entangled in part friendly, part enemy fire, and he finds himself shot twice in the arm. He has to be pulled out of the chaos, and then they perform surgery. He's shot by friendly fire, which was devastating for his men, and they amputate his arm, and shortly thereafter he develops pneumonia and he dies. And it's very, very sad. Robert E. Lee was devastated, and because Stonewall Jackson was probably his best general, and so Robert E. Lee has to face the rest of the war without him. And anyway, the scene in the movie is very, very sad. So Stonewall Jackson's wife, who was with him when he died, they had a daughter together during the war. She actually, I think, probably carried the baby and delivered the baby before he ever got a chance to see the baby. But he did have the opportunity to meet his daughter one time before he passed away. And she was there with him when he died, along with his staff. And she documented his passing in a book that she wrote after his death. And so, from my understanding, most of what we see in that scene is straight from her memoirs. And it was very emotional. He envisions battles and whatnot in his last moments, and then relaxes and says he's going to go sit under the shade of the tree, and he passes. It was very, very, and for me, every time I see the scene, it's very emotional. So anyway, that's how we ended class on Friday. We watched the end of that scene, and so we're going to revisit just briefly on Wednesday to kind of wrap that up, and then we're going to focus on Gettysburg. So if you have your book at home, look in RenWeb. You're going to read the section in chapter 14 that starts with Vicksburg, and then you'll see Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address. And so I'd like for you to read that for class on Wednesday. So if you're at school on Tuesday, grab your book. If you need me to take pictures of it and email them to you, I can do that as well. So we're heading into Gettysburg, which is a cataclysmic moment for the country, and certainly for the Confederate effort. It is considered the high tide or the high water mark of the Confederacy. It's the furthest north they ever get, and they are just decimated in the Battle of Gettysburg. Probably Robert E. Lee's worst call ever. So anyway, that's where we're headed next. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm going to upload this to Google Classroom. And again, I apologize that it sounds weird and that there's a glow behind me and all that. So anyway, I hope you enjoy your 3-day weekend and everybody's back healthy. I'm looking forward to seeing everybody. Bye.